Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today we're continuing my series on what it means to be a Lutheran with my fifth commandment lecture. The fifth commandment is, "You shall not murder." Luther says in the Large Catechism, "The meaning of this commandment, then, is that no one should harm another person for any evil deed, no matter how much that person deserves it. For wherever murder is forbidden, there is also forbidden everything that leads to murder." Now, each of the 10 commandments have three chief characteristics. The first is its origins in the natural law. The second is its overarching command that it seeks to protect. And the third is the outreaching nature of this commandment and how it is applied to the world. Now, the origin of this commandment goes back to the creation week, when on the sixth day God made man and woman in his image. For it says in Genesis 9:6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by many shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Genesis 9 gives man the right to kill and eat animals, but we are not to kill other humans, for they are made in the image of God. Thus, to kill them is to kill God. James 3:9 gives us the same reason for not cursing people, for they are made in the likeness of God. Jesus tells us that this commandment is not just about killing, but about not harming our neighbor either through physical abuse or verbal abuse. All attacks against our fellow human, whether they are physical or verbal, are ultimately attacks against the Creator. The overarching principle that this commandment seeks to protect is human life and well-being. As Luther said in the Small Catechism, we are to fear and love God, so that we do not endanger our neighbor nor harm his life, but instead help and support him in every necessity of life. In this commandment, God seeks to protect the life and welfare of all people. Luther says in the Large Catechism, in short, God wants to have everyone defended, delivered, and protected from the wickedness and violence of others, and he has placed this commandment as a wall, fortress, and refuge around our neighbors, so that no one may do them bodily harm or injury. As mentioned above, this commandment is not just about murder, but about all threats to safety. Jesus says in Matthew 5 during his Sermon on the Mount that the commandment against murder also condemns anger and hatred towards our brother and also verbal abuse. Commenting on Matthew 5, Luther says in the Large Catechism, Christ himself explains and summarizes this commandment: "We must not kill, either by hand, heart, or word, by signs or gestures, but by aiding or abetting." This commandment forbids the direct taking of life, including suicide, euthanasia, and abortion, but also the indirect taking of life, such as assisting in murder, or doing something that would lead to a person's death, such as negligence. For example, in Deuteronomy 22:8, it commands the Israelites to have a parapet or safety railing on their roof to prevent people from falling off. If they did not have a parapet and someone fell off the roof, then they were deemed guilty of that person's blood and were thus considered murderers. Similarly, in Exodus 21:29, it says that if a man's ox is known to be dangerous and accustomed to goring, and then it gores a person to death, the owner is guilty of murder and was to receive the death penalty. The modern equivalent of this would be in a situation in which a dog is known to be vicious and then it kills someone, and thus the owner is guilty of murder as well. Any act that you do which might cause the death is a sin against the fifth commandment. For example, reckless and careless driving, which endangers the lives of not only others but yourself, is a sin against the fifth commandment. In Luther's letter, "Whether One May Flee a Deadly Plague," he states that if you spread a disease through your own carelessness, you are guilty of murder. Additionally, he states that if one does not take proper precautions to prevent themselves from getting sick, then they are guilty of suicide. This commandment also condemns us to care for our neighbor's well-being and condemns us from failing to do so. In the Large Catechism, Luther references Matthew 25:35-44, where Jesus praises people for feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, clothing the naked, etc., while condemning those who do not give these to those in need. James 2:15-16 also condemns those Christians who fail to clothe the naked and feed the hungry. Luther states, "This commandment is violated not only when we do evil, but also when we have opportunity to do good to our neighbour, to prevent, protect, and save them from suffering bodily harm or injury, but fail to do so. If you send a naked person away when you could have clothed him, you have let him freeze to death. If you see anyone who is suffering from hunger and you do not feed her, then you have let her starve." Luther goes on to say that those who do not care for those in need are murderous and bloodthirsty, for although you have not actually committed all these crimes as far as you are concerned, you have nevertheless permitted your neighbours to languish and perish in their misfortune. Therefore, this commandment not only commands us not to kill, but to look after our neighbours' health and welfare, to make sure that they are not only not harmed, but that they live a safe and happy life. Safe and healthy life. In addition to not harming our neighbour in the flesh, we are not to harm them with words or in our heart. In the Large Catechism, Luther gives a brief summary of the 5th commandment, listing 4 ways in which our neighbour is harmed. First, we should not harm anyone, either by hand or deed. Next, we should not use our tongue to advocate or advise harming anyone. 3. Furthermore, we should neither use nor sanction any means or methods whereby anyone may be mistreated. 4. Finally, our heart should harbour no hostility or malice against anyone in a spirit of anger or hatred. Just as Jesus taught in Matthew 5, if you curse your brother or call him hurtful names such as empty head or moron, you are guilty of murdering your brother through words and you are liable to judgment. And if you labour anger and hatred towards your brother, then you are guilty of murder in your heart and are liable to be cast into the eternal fires of Gehenna. Therefore, let us speak well of our neighbours and love them as ourselves. And let us not just love our neighbours and family, but all people, not just those who are kind, but to those who are enemies, to our enemies as well. For as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Even unbelievers love their friends, but we Christians should follow the example of Christ and love our enemies. For as Luther says, it is God's real intention that we should allow no one to suffer harm, but show every kindness and love. And this kindness, as I said, is directed especially towards our enemies, for doing good to friends is nothing more than an ordinary virtue of a pagan, as Christ says in Matthew 5. This commandment is not only given to prevent the taking of life, but to protect and preserve life. It also commands us to produce life. In Genesis 1:28, God commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. One of the chief purposes of marriage is the creation of new life. Humans have a command to procreate. Therefore, if married couples are able to have children, then they should have children. For this reason, birth control, for reasons other than the protection of the life, is sinful, for they are deliberately preventing new life from forming. Although, since the 5th commandment commands us to protect life, if pregnancy would risk the life of either the mother or potential child, it is sinful, then it would be permissible to use birth control in order to preserve life. However, in such a scenario, we should never ever use abortive birth controls that kill fertilizers' eggs. For life starts at conception, and thus it is murder to kill an egg that has been fertilized. Lastly, some think that is important to remember about this commandment is the right to bear the sword. In Genesis 9:6, God established the death penalty, stating that whoever committed murder was to be put to death. And some people are confused by this and wonder why God would command us to kill someone if the 5th commandment was about the preservation of life. You can often see this today amongst many reformed people who claim to be pro-life And so that means they are not only anti-abortion, but that they are anti the death penalty. However, the Bible teaches us that we should be against abortion, but that we should be pro-death penalty. This is because we live in a fallen, sinful world, and sometimes in order to preserve life, life must be taken. You see this in warfare all the time. In order to protect our nation, we must kill our enemies. The purpose of the death penalty, then, is to curb wickedness in society by killing those who would harm others. Thus, Romans 13:4 states that God has given the government the authority to bear the sword. This gives the government the authority to execute dangerous criminals, but also to participate in wars and also to arrest and punish criminals. Just as the fifth commandment is not limited to murder, but includes all forms of violence, so too the right of the sword encompasses all use of physical force. Luther states that the government is not included in the command not to murder, but that God has delegated to civil authorities the power to punish evildoers. As Luther says, what is forbidden here applies to individuals, not to the governmental officials. In addition to this is the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. As we pointed out in the previous sermon on the fourth commandment, the office of government stems from the office of parent. In the Large Catechism, Luther references Deuteronomy 21:18-20, where parents are given the authority to execute their children. Luther states that this was done in former times, but now the authority belongs to the government. However, Proverbs 13:24 does state that the parent still retains the right of the rod, this is corporal punishment, in order to discipline their children. For just as the government must use force and the threat of death to protect one citizen from another, so too parents might need to use force and physical discipline to protect one child from another. In addition to this, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate is the teaching that lesser authorities have the right to wield the sword in order to protect those who are under their care. The government may use the sword to protect their citizens from outside threats. So too, this means lesser authorities need to do the same. This includes the right of a father or mother using the sword to defend their household, as it says in Nehemiah 4:14, "Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." Thus, just as the government possesses the right to wield the sword to defend the nation from outside threats, so too, parents can wield the sword to defend their households. However, the Bible does give regulations as to how one shall wield the sword in such a situation. And for example, in Exodus 22:2-3, it states that if a man breaks into your house at night and you kill him, you are not guilty of murder. But if he breaks in during the day and you kill him, then you are guilty of murder. The reason given by scholars to explain this complex situation is that if a thief broke in during the day, it would be easy to determine whether he was merely a thief or whether he was a violent criminal. In addition, you could determine during the day, during the day, it is most likely that there would be other people around to help assist you in apprehending the criminal without the loss of life. However, during the night, it is harder to determine whether such a person is merely a sneak thief or whether they are a violent murderer. And it is therefore also less likely to receive any assistance in the middle of the night. Thus, the homeowner is justified in killing this unknown intruder. Additionally, we are not to use the right of the sword in vengeance, for vengeance belongs to the Lord. Nor are we as individuals to use the right of the sword for justice or judgment. Instead, God had instituted the government to bear the sword against criminals. This is the sin committed by Simeon and Levi against the Shechemites, and also by Absalom against his brother Amnon. In Genesis 34, Dinah is raped by Shechem. Following this incident, King Hamor, the father of Shechem, and Jacob, the father of Dinah, discussed the possibility of Shechem marrying Dinah. It was agreed that Shechem could marry Dinah if all the city of Shechem were circumcised. And this is no small matter, as circumcision was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Thus, the request was actually that the Shechemites convert to Judaism. Both Hamor, the leader of the Shechemites, and Jacob, the leader of the Israelites, agreed to this arrangement. But following this, Simeon and Levi took justice into their own hands and they slew all the Shechemites. Similarly, in 2 Samuel 13, Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. David fails to punish Amnon for this act. The Dead Sea Scrolls add an extra line between verses 21 and 22 saying that David would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him as he was his firstborn. Whatever the reason is, David did not punish Amnon, and the scriptures do not mention a punishment. It is clear that Amnon was not put to death, but he may have actually received some lesser punishment, although we are not told of this. Regardless, Absalom, feeling that justice had not been served, took it upon himself to kill his brother. In both situations, Simeon, Levi, and Absalom were considered to have sinned. They broke the fifth commandment because they had taken a life that was not theirs to take. And they also have broken the fourth commandment by usurping the right of the sword from the government. It is not for individuals to seek out justice or revenge if they feel that the government has not properly settled the matter. For example, the Bible is clear that the punishment for murder is the death penalty. Yet in places like Australia, we have outlawed the death penalty, meaning that murder is simply a sentence to time in prison. But despite this failure from our government to wield the sword properly and to execute murderers, it does not then give the right of the citizens to wield the sword to kill these murderers. Instead, we are to leave vengeance to the Lord and treat our enemies with love. As Luther said, God wants to encourage and urge us to true, noble, exalted deeds such as a gentleness, patience, and in short, love and kindness towards our enemies. He always wants to remind us to recall the first commandment, that He is our God, that is, that He wishes to help, comfort, and protect us, so that He may restrain us from desire for revenge. Our God is a God of love, who commands us to love one another as He has loved us. We are to give of ourselves for the good of our neighbour, love our enemy, and lay down our own lives for the good of others. Jesus gave us His life. Jesus gave up His life in order to give us eternal life. He was crucified while a murderer was set free. And this He did for us, His enemies. God provides for us daily. He protects us and preserves us. He died for us. God desires to preserve our life, our safety, and our welfare, and He asks us to do the same for our fellow neighbour. We should abound in doing good for our neighbour, for they are made in the image of God, and through service of them we in turn serve God. We are not to hate, to curse, to harm or kill our neighbour, for they are made in God's image. Instead, let us preserve and protect their life and care for them in all times of need. For as Christ said, "Truly I say to you, what you did to one of the least of these, you have done to me." And this ends my lecture on the fifth commandment. Join us again next time as we discuss the sixth commandment. I've been your host, Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.